Chapter 35, Whitecross Street Prison. A cold, drizzling rain was falling as Chichester proceeded along the streets leading to the debtors' prison. The noise of pattens upon the pavement, the number of umbrellas that were up, the splashing of horses' feet and carriage wheels in the kennels, the rush of cabs and the shouting of omnibus cads were all characteristic of a wet night in a crowded metropolis. Chichester shivered, more through nervousness than actual cold, and he felt an oppressive sensation at the bottom of his stomach as well as at the chest. The officer endeavored to console him by observing that it was lucky he had been taken so close to the prison on such a rainy night. The ruined young man envied many a poor wretch whom he passed on his way, for he knew that it was far easier to get into a debtor's jail than to get out of it. At length they arrived at the prison. It was now 9 o'clock, and the place, viewed by the flickering light of the lamp at the gate of the governor's house, wore a melancholy and somber appearance. The prisoner was introduced into a small lobby, where an elderly turnkey with knee breeches and gaiters thrust a small loaf of bread into his hand, and immediately consigned him to the care of another turnkey, who led him through several alleys to the staircase communicating with the receiving ward. The turnkey pulled a wire which rang a bell on the first floor. "Who rings?" cried a voice at the top of the stairs. "Sheriff's debtor, Arthur Chichester, L.S., replied the turnkey in a loud sing-song voice. Chichester afterwards learnt that he was mentioned as a sheriff's prisoner in contradistinction to one arrested by a warrant from the Court of Requests, and that L.S. meant London side, an intimation that he had been arrested in the city of London and not in the county of Middlesex. Having ascended a flight of stone steps, Chichester was met at the door of the receiving ward by the steward thereof. This steward was himself a prisoner, but was considered a trustworthy person, and had therefore been selected by the governor to preside over that department of the prison. The receiving ward was a long, low room, with windows secured by bars at each end. There were 2 grates, but only one contained any fire. The place was remarkably clean, the floor, the deal tables, and the forms being as white as snow. The following conversation forthwith took place between the new prisoner and the steward. "What is your name?" "Arthur Chichester." "Have you got your bread?" "Yes." "Well, put it in that pigeonhole. Do you choose to have sheets tonight on your bed?" "Certainly." "Then that will be a shilling the first night and 6 pence every night after, as long as you remain here. You can, moreover, sleep in the inner room and sit up till 12 o'clock. Those who can't afford to pay for sheets sleep in a room by themselves and go to bed at the 10:15. You see, we know how to separate the gentleman from the riffraff." It's a debtor's prison, so people are there because they owe money. Now we have those like Chichester who owe money because they've been swindling people their whole lives. But then you have people who owe money just because they're poor. And once they get into debtor's prison, they are further penalized for not having money to pay for their necessities. So the penal system in 19th century England was horrific. "And how long shall I be allowed to stay up in the receiving ward?" "That depends. Do you mean to live at my table? I charge 6 pence for tea, the same for breakfast, a shilling for dinner, and 4 pence for supper." "Well, I shall be most happy to live at your table." "In that case, write a note to the governor to say you are certain to be able to settle your affairs in the course of a week, and I will take care he shall have it the very first thing tomorrow morning." "But I am not sure of being able to settle in a week." "Do as you like. You won't be allowed to stay up here unless you do." "Oh, in that case I will do so at once. Can you oblige me with a sheet of writing paper?" "Certainly. Here is one. A penny, if you please." Chichester paid for the paper and wrote the letter, then handed it to the steward. He then cast a glance around the room and saw 3 or 4 tolerably decent-looking persons warming themselves at the fire, while 15 or 16 wretched-looking men, dressed for the most part as laborers, were sitting on the forms around the walls at a considerable distance from the blazing grate. The steward, perceiving that the new prisoner threw a look of inquiry towards him, said, "Those gentlemen at the fire are sheriff's debtors and live at my table. Those chaps over there are Court of Requests men and haven't a shilling to bless themselves with, so of course I can't allow them to associate with the others." "How many prisoners upon an average pass through the receiving ward in the course of 1 year?" "About 3,300, as near as I can guess. All the debtors receive each so much bread and meat a week. The prison costs the city close upon £9,000 a year." "9,000 a year spent to lock men up away from their families!" exclaimed Chichester. "That sum would pay the debts of the greater portion of those who are unfortunate enough to be brought here." "You may well say that," returned the steward. "Why, half the prisoners who come here are poor working men, snatched away from their labor and obliged to know that their wives and children will starve during their absence." That man over there with a little bundle tied up in a blue cotton handkerchief is arrested for only 8 pennies. The costs are 3 and 6 pence. He is actually a prisoner then for 4 and 2 pence. Exactly. The man next to him is arrested for 3 cents, the balance of a chandler's shop debt. His costs are 5 shillings. But the case of that poor devil who was crying so up in the corner is the worst. It appears that he had an account at a tally shop and paid 1 shilling a week toward its liquidation. He was in full work and earned 18 shillings a week, and so he regularly gave his wife the money every Saturday night to put away for the tally man. But the woman is fond of tippling, and she spent the money in gin. Well, the tallyman takes out a summons from the Court of Requests. The wife receives it and is afraid to tell her husband. Next week comes the rules. The woman also hides, hoping somehow or another to get together the debt and costs and settle it unknown to her husband, but no such thing. So this morning, as the poor fellow was going home to dinner, he was arrested for 4 shillings debt and 6 shillings costs. This was cruel indeed, observed Chichester, to whom all these details were perfectly new. Yes, continued the steward, but that is nothing to the things that I have heard men tell up in this room. Loan societies, tally shops, and the low pettifogging lawyers keep this place well filled. It was now 10:15, and the poor wretches who could not afford to pay for sheets were huddled off to bed. Chichester and the gentleman who boarded at the steward's table remained up, smoking cigars and drinking ale, until 12. Chichester was then introduced into a large room containing 10 or a dozen beds, whose framework was made of iron. One miserably thin blanket, a horse cloth, and a straw mattress and pillow were all provided for each couch by the Corporation of the City of London. Oh, how generous, how philanthropic, how noble to tear men away from their homes and give them straw wrapped up in coarse ticking to sleep upon. On the following morning, Chichester awoke early, and rose with every bone aching from the hardness of his bed. He performed his toilette in a species of scullery attached to the receiving ward, and the enjoyment of this luxury was attended with the following disbursement. Towel, 2 cents. Use of soap, 1 cent. Loan of razor and lather box, 1 cent. Breakfast, consisting of coffee and dry toast, was then served up. Those who boarded with the steward sat down and commenced a desperate attempt upon the provisions, and those who fancied an egg or a rasher of bacon with their meal paid 2 pence extra. The conversation was entirely associated with the prison affairs. It appeared as if those men, when once they set foot in the prison, discarded all thoughts of the great world without, from which they had been snatched away. Even when the morning newspaper came in, attention was first directed by a strange kind of sympathy to the list of bankrupts and to the law notices, the latter of which afforded them the pleasing and interesting intelligence of who were that day to appear before the commissioners of the insolvent court. At 9:05, a violent ring at the bell called the steward in haste to the door. This was the summons of a turnkey who came to remove new prisoners to the respective departments of the establishment to which they belonged. Thus they were classified into Middlesex sheriff's debtors, London sheriff's debtors, and City freemen who were also sheriff's debtors, and London Court of Request's debtors, and Middlesex Court of Request debtors. Chichester was ordered to remove to the poultry ward on the London side. The governor declined to comply with the request contained in his letter. It will be seen from what we have already said that Whitecross Street Prison is essentially different from the Bench, descriptions of which have been given in so many different works, and the leading features of which are so familiar to a large portion of the community, either from hearsay or experience. If a man cannot muster 4 or 5 pounds to transfer himself from the custody of the sheriffs to that of the judges by a habeas corpus writ, he must remain in Whitecross Street Prison, while the more wealthy debtors enjoy every luxury and privilege in the Bench. And yet we are constantly assured that there is the same law for the poor as there is for the rich. The system of imprisonment for debt is in itself impolitic, unwise, and cruel in the extreme. It ruins the honest man and destroys the little remnant of good feeling existing in the heart of the callous one. It establishes the absurd doctrine that if a man cannot pay his debt while he is allowed the exercise of his talents, his labor, and his acquirements, he can when shut up in the narrow compass of a prison where his talents, his labor, and his acquirements are useless. How eminently narrow-sighted are English legislators. They fear totally to abolish this absurd custom because they dread that credit will suffer. Why, credit is altogether begotten in confidence, and never arises from the preconceived intention on the part of him who gives it to avail himself of this law against him who receives it. Larceny and theft are punished by a limited imprisonment with an allowance of food, but debtors who commit no crime may linger and languish and starve in jail. Debtors in debtors' prison had to remain there until they paid off their debt, but they weren't allowed to work because they were in prison, so they couldn't pay off their debt, and they had to pay for their imprisonment also, and so the amount they owed would just continue to grow. It wasn't unusual for people, like they said, to simply die there because they couldn't get out. So it was a harsh, harsh way to approach poverty, essentially. The poultry ward was a long, dark, low room with 7 or 8 barred windows on each side, sawdust upon the stone floor, and about a dozen or 14 small tables arranged, like those of a coffee house, around the walls. The room was full of debtors of all appearances, from the shabby genteel down to the absolutely ragged. Here a prisoner was occupied in drawing up his schedule for the insolvent debtors' court. There an emaciated old man was writing a letter over which he shed bitter and scalding tears. At another table, a young farmer's laborer-looking man was breakfasting off bread and cheese and onions, which he washed down with porter. Close by was a stout, seedy-looking person with gray hair, who did not seem to have any breakfast at all. In this nook, a poor, pale wretch was reading a newspaper. In that corner, another individual was examining a pile of letters. Several were gathered round the fire in the scullery or kitchen attached to the ward, preparing their breakfasts, and others were lounging up and down the room, laughing and talking over the amusements of the preceding night up in the sleeping rooms. The steward of the poultry ward had just finished his breakfast when the turnkey introduced Mr. Chichester. "Well, Mr. Thanes," said the steward, quite delighted to see the new prisoner, "I begin to think we should have had none down this morning. Pray take a seat, sir." This invitation was addressed to Chichester, who sat down accordingly. The steward, after exchanging a few observations with the turnkey, produced a book from a drawer in the table, and, addressing himself in a semi-mysterious tone to Mr. Chichester, said, "These are our rules and regulations. Every new member is required to pay an entrance fee of £1 6, and this goes toward the fund for paying the officers and servants of the ward, providing coal, and administering generally to the comforts of the place." "I am quite satisfied with the justice of the charge," said Chichester, and he paid it accordingly. "I suppose you will live at my table?" inquired the steward. "Same charges as upstairs in the receiving ward." "Oh, certainly," answered Chichester. "Have you any body here of any consequence at all?" "Not particularly at this moment. Lord William Priggin stayed a couple of days with us and went over to the bench yesterday morning." "Who is that gentleman walking up and down the narrow court outside?" inquired Chichester, glancing towards a window through which might be seen a tall, slim young man with black mustachios, a long faded cotton dressing gown, a dingy velvet skull cap, and pantaloons hanging low and loose because the owner had forgotten his braces. "Oh, that is Count Pichantos, a celebrated Russian nobleman who was cleaned out some weeks since at a West End hell and got put into prison for his hotel bill." "And who is that respectable old gentleman with the bald head and dressed in black?" "That is a clergyman, the Reverend Henry Sharper. He is an excellent preacher, they say, and the best securer of a die that I ever saw in my life." "And that very sickly, pale-faced youth, who seems to be scarcely 20? "He is only 21 in a month. He was arrested the day after he became of age for blank acceptances, which he had given during his minority to the tune of £3,000, and for which he never received more than 300. "And that quiet-looking old gentleman at the table opposite?" "He is a chancery prisoner, committed for contempt. It appears that he was one morning walking by the auction mart and saw large posting bills announcing the immediate sale of an estate consisting of 13 houses somewhere in Finsbury, under a decree of the Court of Chancery. My gentleman hadn't a guinea in his pocket nor the means of raising one at the time. Nevertheless, he walked into the mart as bold as brass, strode upstairs to the auctioneer's rooms, and bid for the estate. There were plenty of competitors, but he didn't care. He bid away, and at last the estate was knocked down to him for £4,300. When sales are effected under an order of the Chancellor, no deposit money is required. This may seem strange to you, but it is not the less of a fact. So off walks my gentleman, quite rejoiced at his bargain. The first thing he does is to go and collect all the arrears of rent he can from the tenants of the houses, to distrain upon those who couldn't or wouldn't pay. What a game he did play, to be sure. He called into the request the services of half the brokers in Finsbury, and made the tenants cash up to the very last farthing that was due, while the lawyers employed for the sale of the estate drew up the deeds of conveyance and the abstract of the title, but my gentleman never meant paying. So at last the Chancery Court, getting tired of his excuses and finding that he would not disgorge the amount he had already received for rents, nor yet come down with a shilling toward the purchase money, clapped him into limbo under some form or another, and so here he is. In this manner did the steward of the poultry ward render the new prisoner familiar with the leading characters of that department of the prison. In addition to the few instances of flagrant dishonesty or culpable extravagance which were pointed out to Chichester, information was given him of many, very many cases of pure and unadulterated misfortune. The churchyard has known no sorrow. The death chamber has known no anguish equal to that acute and poignant suffering which many an inmate endures within the walls of that prison. If he be an affectionate father, he thinks of his absent little ones, and he feels shocked at the cold cruelty of the rules which only permit children to visit their incarcerated sire twice a week, on Wednesday and Sunday, and then only for 3 hours each time. If he be a kind husband and possesses a tender and loving wife, he dreads the fatal hour of 5 of an evening, which is the signal for all strangers and visitors to leave these walls. Misery, lank, lean, palpable misery, is the characteristic of Whitecross Street Prison. The legislature says, we only allow men to be locked up in order to prevent them from running away without paying the debts they owe. Then why treat them as felons? Why impose upon them rules and regulations the severity of which is as galling to their souls as the iron chains of Newgate are to the felon's flesh? Why break their spirits and crush their good and generous feelings in compelling them all to be herded together, the high and the low, the polite and the vulgar, the temperate and the drunkard, the cleanly and the filthy, the religious and the profane, the sedate and the ribald? O excellent legislators, do you believe that a man ever went out of the debtor's jail more moral and better disposed than he was when he went in? The answer to this question will, in one word, teach you the efficacy of imprisonment for debt. I've mentioned before that a lot of these Penny Dreadful authors talked at great length and expounded upon issues of the day, the things that especially affected their readers who tended to be working class. It was their opportunity to draw attention to what was going on that the legislature and the upper classes tended to ignore. So you're getting a lot of that here, a lot of very bare bones, no frills attached explanation of what it was like in debtor's prison and the impact of debtor's laws on the people of the day. So you're going to get a little more of that in here, but it also helps open our eyes to what life was like for a lot of people in the 19th century. And unfortunately, we still have, within most justice systems throughout the world, lots of unfairness and inequity like we see here. Chichester walked out into a large stone-paved court attached to the ward and bearing the attractive but somewhat elusive name of the Park. At 12 o'clock, the beer men from the public houses in Whitecross Street were allowed to admittance, and then commenced the debauchery of the day. The seats around the park were soon crowded with prisoners and visitors, drinking, smoking, laughing, and swearing. Many poor wretches who could not boast of much strength of mind, but were in reality well disposed, took to this occupation to kill care. And who will blame them? Not you, proud peer, who bury your vexations in crystal goblets sparkling with the choicest juice of Epernay's grape. Nor you, fine gentlemen, who seek in gaming at your club a relief from the anxieties and petty troubles which now and then interrupt the otherwise even tenure of your day. In the course of the day, Mr. Chichester wrote a very penitent letter to his father, the pawnbroker, lamenting past follies and promising future good conduct. The postscript contained an intimation that prison was bad enough when one possessed plenty of money, but that it was 10,000 times worse when associated with empty pockets. This precious epistle succeeded in inducing the old gentleman, as Chichester denominated his father, to loosen his purse strings and remit a few pounds to supply immediate wants. Chichester was thus enabled to live at the steward's table and smoke his cigars and drink his ale to his heart's content. In a small community like that of a ward in Whitecross Street, as well as in the great world without, he who has the most money is the most looked up to, which is a phrase perfectly understood and almost synonymous with respected, and thus Mr. Chichester very speedily became the star of that department of the prison to which he had been assigned. So that's the end of the chapter. We have Chichester, who is in debtor's prison right now, but because he was able to scrounge up some money, he's actually living pretty high within there. And I have a feeling that's going to play a role going down the road. I have a feeling he's not going to change at all. Meanwhile, we have Richard, who actually helped poor prisoners and poor people during his original hearing for being in the gambling den, is in prison for 2 years. We have Eliza, who was duped into her role in that fraud, who is in Newgate for 2 years. We'll see what happens with all these people.